An elderly black woman, driving a luxury car through her own neighborhood, is stopped by a suspicious cop who demands answers. What he doesn't know: she's not just a millionaire, her legacy has already touched his life in ways he never imagined. By the end of their encounter, this officer will be brought to his knees and his world turned upside down. What shocking truth could make this happen? Keep watching to find out. The story begins on a warm, sunlit afternoon in Oakwood Heights, a picturesque and affluent neighborhood lined with manicured lawns and towering oak trees. The tranquility is only broken by the low hum of a sleek black Bentley Continental GT gliding smoothly down the pristine main road. Its glossy finish gleams under the sunlight, drawing the occasional curious glance from passers-by. Inside the car sits Margaret Johnson, an elderly black woman whose graceful presence commands attention. Her silver hair, neatly styled, frames her face, accentuating her wise yet serene expression. She is dressed in a sophisticated yet understated outfit, her pearl earrings catching the light as she adjusts her position in the driver's seat. Margaret's hands rest lightly on the steering wheel, but her right hand occasionally moves to clasp the gold necklace around her wrist. The delicate heirloom, a gift from her late brother James, holds deep sentimental value. It is more than jewelry. It is a source of strength, a reminder of her family's resilience, and a testament to her journey from humble beginnings to a life of purpose and success. As the Bentley slows at a stop sign, Margaret allows her thoughts to wander. She has just left a meeting for her educational foundation, which provides scholarships to underprivileged youth. The satisfaction of helping children achieve dreams that once seemed unreachable fills her heart with warmth. She smiles faintly, recalling stories of students whose lives have been transformed by her efforts. The atmosphere in Oakwood Heights is one of serene exclusivity, but there is an unspoken tension beneath its surface. While Margaret has lived in the neighborhood for years, she is no stranger to the quiet, judgmental stares and whispered remarks from those who question her presence. She dismisses these moments, finding solace in the respect she has earned through her contributions to the community. However, as Margaret continues her drive, she notices the subtle yet unmistakable shadow of a police car following her. Its red and blue lights remain off, but the vehicle's persistent presence triggers a faint unease. Her calm demeanor does not falter, though, as she glances in the rearview mirror. The camera pans out to show the stark contrast between Margaret's poised, dignified presence and the growing tension of the situation. The neighborhood, with its gated mansions and quiet streets, exudes wealth and exclusivity. Yet Margaret's journey through these streets carries a weight of defiance against a history of prejudice. The scene closes with Margaret gripping her necklace tightly as the police car inches closer. Her composed expression reveals no fear, but her eyes reflect an unspoken question: will they see who I am, or only what they want to see? The quiet streets of Oakwood Heights basked under the golden rays of the afternoon sun. It was a serene scene, with perfectly trimmed lawns and the occasional hum of luxury cars cruising past. Among them, a sleek black Bentley glided smoothly down the road, drawing glances from neighbors walking their dogs or tending their gardens. Inside the car sat Margaret Johnson, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the windshield. Dressed in an elegant outfit of soft pastels and pearls, she exuded grace and dignity. Margaret had just left a charity event for her foundation, Evelyn's Embrace. It was one of her proudest achievements, a beacon of hope for families needing support, much like her own in years past. She held a delicate gold necklace in her hand, gently brushing her thumb over the small engraved J. It was a keepsake from her late brother, James, whose memory kept her grounded. She sighed deeply, thinking of the children her foundation had helped and the future she hoped to create. As Margaret turned onto a quieter street, the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror startled her. A police cruiser was trailing her, its siren piercing the tranquil afternoon air. Margaret frowned but remained calm. She was driving well below the speed limit, and her registration and license were in perfect order. Still, she pulled over, her hands steady as she turned off the car and waited. From the patrol car, Officer Ethan Brown stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. His tall frame and sharp features exuded authority, but there was a tightness in his expression, a flicker of something deeper. Ethan had been patrolling the affluent neighborhood for months, keeping an eye out for anything or anyone that seemed out of place. The sight of the Bentley driven by an elderly black woman immediately raised his suspicions. The car was too expensive, too out of sync with the image he had in his mind. "What brings you to this area?" Ethan asked curtly, leaning slightly toward the driver's window. Margaret met his gaze, her composure unwavering. "I live here, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan glanced at the neighborhood's quiet opulence before eyeing Margaret. "You live here?" he repeated, his tone laced with doubt. "Yes, at 1224 Maple Street," she replied evenly. She reached into the glove compartment, retrieving her license and registration, and handed them to Ethan. Ethan took the documents, his eyes scanning them quickly. Everything appeared to be in order, but his suspicions lingered. He stared at the gold necklace in her hand and frowned. "Is that necklace yours?" Margaret's hand instinctively tightened around it, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It is," she replied, her tone growing cooler. "It belonged to my brother." Ethan couldn't explain why, but the necklace looked familiar, stirring something in the recesses of his memory. Still, he pushed the thought aside. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car, man," he said, his voice firm but unnecessarily cold. Margaret's eyebrows lifted. "Officer, my documents are in order. Is there a specific reason for this request?" "Step out of the car," Ethan repeated, his hand resting on his belt as his voice sharpened. Margaret sighed softly. She had dealt with moments like this before, and though it angered her, she refused to let it show. She pushed the door open and stepped out, standing tall and composed. By now, a few neighbors had noticed the commotion. Some stopped to watch, whispering among themselves. "That's Mrs. Johnson," one woman said, recording the interaction with her phone. "She's lived here for years." "She runs that big charity," another man murmured, his tone puzzled. Ethan, unaware of the growing crowd, began questioning Margaret further. "How did you afford this car? Are you sure you're not borrowing it from someone?" Margaret straightened her posture, a piercing gaze fixed on Ethan. "Officer," she said firmly, "I would like to know why I'm being treated as though I've done something wrong." Ethan faltered slightly but didn't back down. "It's standard procedure," he muttered, though the justification sounded weak even to him. Margaret's calm demeanor remained intact, but her voice carried the weight of her frustration. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. I've built a foundation that has supported thousands of families, including, perhaps, someone you know. Yet, here I am, being questioned as though I don't belong." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and several phones now recorded the scene. Ethan glanced around, noticing the onlookers for the first time. His grip on his belt loosened, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. Margaret's steady voice broke the tension. "If you still need to verify something, I'll gladly cooperate. But let me remind you, Officer Brown, assumptions can often lead us astray." Ethan stepped back, uncertain for the first time. The growing awareness of the crowd, the whispers of recognition, and the undeniable dignity with which Margaret carried herself began to weigh on him. As Margaret stood tall against the setting sun, her silver hair catching the light, the stark contrast between her grace and the officer's hostility painted a powerful picture. Unbeknownst to Ethan, this encounter would soon turn his world upside down and force him to confront truths he had long ignored. At the police station, the air was thick with tension. Margaret Johnson sat on a cold metal bench, her hands resting on her lap, the gold necklace still clasped firmly in her grip. Her composed demeanor remained, but the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes betrayed the emotional weight of the situation. Officer Ethan Brown shuffled uneasily behind the desk, occasionally stealing glances at Margaret. He had planned for this to be a routine check, but nothing about it felt routine anymore. Margaret's name had sparked quiet murmurs among the officers at the station. "Is that the Margaret Johnson?" one whispered to another. "She's the one who runs Evelyn's Embrace," another replied. "My cousin's kids got scholarships through her foundation." The whispers weren't lost on Ethan, though he tried to focus on the task at hand. He avoided Margaret's gaze as he typed her information into the system. Everything matched perfectly: her address, her car registration, her driver's license. It was all in pristine order. "Do you know who she is?" another officer muttered to Ethan as he passed by. "That's not someone you want to mess with." Ethan bristled but kept his focus on the screen. He didn't need to be told how to do his job. Margaret, sitting just a few feet away, maintained her silence. She had been in situations like this before. Prejudice wasn't new to her, but the sting of it never dulled. Finally, Ethan stood and walked toward Margaret with her documents in hand. His footsteps echoed in the quiet room, and he forced himself to meet her steady gaze. "Everything checks out," he said stiffly. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her piercing eyes studying him. "Of course it does," she said calmly. "I told you as much when you pulled me over." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling a flicker of guilt. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Grateful for the distraction, he stepped away to answer the call. "Ethan." It was his wife, Emily, her voice trembling with emotion. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You won't believe this," Emily said, her voice breaking with relief. "We just got a call from the hospital. Danny's surgery, the entire cost has been paid for. All of it." Ethan froze. His mind raced. "What do you mean? Who paid for it?" "The Margaret Johnson Foundation," Emily said, her voice shaking with gratitude. "They covered everything, Ethan. It's a miracle." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs as the weight of her words sank in. He turned to glance at Margaret, who was still seated, her posture upright, her expression calm. It couldn't be. The woman he had humiliated and treated with suspicion was the same person whose foundation had saved his son's life. Ethan ended the call and walked back to his desk, his thoughts swirling. He stared at Margaret's gold necklace as it gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and suddenly a memory stirred. Years ago, as a child, Ethan had seen an old photograph of his father holding a similar necklace. It was tucked away in a box of keepsakes his father rarely discussed. Ethan had dismissed it as insignificant at the time, but now it came rushing back, colliding with the reality in front of him. Margaret noticed his hesitation. "Something on your mind, officer?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. Ethan looked at her, struggling to find the words. "That necklace, it's important to you, isn't it?" Margaret nodded, her gaze unwavering. "It was a gift from my brother. The only thing I have left of him." Her words pierced Ethan's heart, the connection becoming clearer. He couldn't shake the image of the old photograph, the similar necklace, and the growing realization that the woman before him was far more than he had assumed. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said finally, his voice low. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "And what exactly are you apologizing for, officer?" Ethan hesitated. "For treating you unfairly. For making assumptions I had no right to make." Margaret tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Are you apologizing for your actions, or for who I turned out to be?" Ethan's throat tightened. He had no answer. Margaret stood, her movements deliberate and composed. "Officer Brown," she said firmly, "it's not me you've wronged. It's yourself. Think carefully about the kind of man you want to be." With that, Margaret left the station, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she had endured. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. For the first time, he saw the cracks in the foundation of his beliefs, and the guilt threatened to consume him. The woman he had tried to reduce to a stereotype had shattered his assumptions and left him questioning everything he thought he knew. Ethan Brown sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. The name Margaret Johnson was scrawled neatly at the top, but it loomed larger in his mind than the letters suggested. He couldn't stop replaying the incident over and over, her calm demeanor, her piercing questions, and the quiet dignity she carried despite his treatment of her. His thoughts were interrupted by the memory of his wife's call. The Margaret Johnson Foundation. The name now seemed like a drumbeat in his head. This wasn't just an influential woman he had wrongly detained, she was the very reason his son had a chance at life. Still, something about her necklace lingered in his mind. That simple piece of gold, its shape so familiar, felt like a thread pulling him towards something deeper. He rummaged through his desk drawer, retrieving an old photograph he had saved from his late father's belongings. The photo showed his father as a young boy, held protectively by a tall, broad-shouldered man. Around the man's neck dangled a necklace, a gold charm identical to the one Margaret had clutched during their encounter. Ethan's breath caught. Could it be the same? Could Margaret be connected to his family? The need for answers overwhelmed him. He logged onto his computer and began sifting through public records. His search led him to a name, James Johnson, a man listed as Margaret's brother. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. James Johnson. The same name his father had mentioned in passing years ago. Ethan clicked through more records, his suspicions solidifying with each discovery. James Johnson had once lived in the same neighborhood as his grandparents. And then, like a puzzle falling into place, he found it, a birth record. James Johnson had a sister, Margaret Johnson, and a son, Ethan's father. The revelation hit Ethan like a tidal wave. Margaret wasn't just a stranger he had wronged. She was his great-aunt. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret sat in her quiet study, the gold necklace resting on her palm. Her thoughts were clouded with memories of her brother James. She hadn't spoken about him in years, but seeing Ethan had stirred something in her, an ache for answers she had buried long ago. Unable to let it rest, Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Landmarks, a private investigator she had worked with in the past. "Linda, I need you to look into someone for me," Margaret said, her voice steady but resolute. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson." "Who?" "Ethan Brown. He's a police officer. I need to know if he has any ties to my brother, James Dunner." Linda agreed without hesitation, and Margaret sat back in her chair, waiting for answers. The following day, Margaret's phone rang. It was Linda, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and caution. "Mrs. Johnson, I've uncovered something significant. Ethan Brown is James's grandson, your great-nephew." The phone nearly slipped from Margaret's hand. Her heart raced as years of longing and unanswered questions flooded her mind. Could this young officer, who had so wrongly judged her, be family? Margaret leaned back, clutching the necklace tightly. "Thank you, Linda," she said softly before hanging up. Ethan, too, had spent the night grappling with his discovery. He couldn't shake the guilt that had taken root. How could he have treated his own family member with such disdain? Determined to make amends, he decided to visit Margaret. Standing on her doorstep, Ethan felt a wave of unease wash over him. Would she even let him in? He knocked lightly, the sound echoing in the quiet street. Margaret opened the door, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Mrs. Johnson, Margaret," he said, his voice trembling. "I've learned the truth. About my father. About your brother. About us." Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. They sat in her living room, the silence heavy between them. Ethan struggled to find the words, but Margaret spoke first. "James was my younger brother," she said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "He was the most loving person I've ever known. He gave me this necklace before he left." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I didn't know. I didn't know he was my grandfather. I didn't know you were." He trailed off, unable to finish. Margaret studied him for a long moment. "And if you had known?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. "Would you have treated me differently?" Ethan looked down, shame burning in his chest. "I want to say yes. But the truth is, I don't know. That's the problem, isn't it?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "It's not enough to be sorry, Ethan. Regret without change means nothing." "I want to change," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I want to make this right. Not just with you, but with the way I've been living." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression softening for the first time. "We'll see, Ethan. Words are easy. Actions are what matter." As Ethan left her home that evening, the weight of his mistakes pressed heavily on him. But for the first time, he also felt a glimmer of hope, the hope that he could start to mend what had been broken, in both his family and himself. Margaret Johnson's words echoed in Ethan's mind as he drove home. Regret without change means nothing. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, the guilt of his actions intertwined with a growing resolve. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about proving, through action, that he could change. The following morning, Ethan made a decision. He would dedicate his time to righting the wrongs he had committed, starting with Margaret's foundation, Evelyn's embrace. It wasn't just a way to repair his relationship with her, but a chance to address the biases that had led to his mistakes. Ethan arrived at Evelyn's embrace unannounced. The bustling community center was filled with activity, children working on art projects, parents attending workshops, and volunteers coordinating donations. The atmosphere hummed with hope and purpose. Margaret noticed Ethan the moment he stepped in. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he approached her. "I'm here to help," Ethan said firmly, meeting her gaze. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. No excuses." Margaret folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "This isn't a one-day fix, Ethan. If you're here for the long haul, you need to prove it." "I will," Ethan replied without hesitation. Margaret nodded and handed him a list. "Start with the storage room. We need those supplies organized for next week's seminar." Ethan got to work immediately. The task was mundane, stacking boxes and sorting supplies, but he took it seriously, knowing that every effort mattered. As he worked, he overheard conversations around him. A young woman was sharing her story with a group of volunteers about the struggles she faced after being unjustly evicted due to racial bias. A man described how Evelyn's embrace had helped him reconcile with his estranged family. Hearing these stories made Ethan realize the extent of the pain caused by prejudice and how vital the Foundation's work was. Over the following weeks, Ethan immersed himself in every aspect of Evelyn's embrace. He attended workshops on unconscious bias, often feeling uncomfortable but determined to confront his own ingrained prejudices. Margaret observed him closely, her skepticism gradually giving way to quiet approval. Ethan wasn't just showing up, he was learning, listening, and putting in the effort to grow. The real test came when Margaret assigned Ethan a speaking role at an upcoming seminar on bias and its impact on law enforcement. "You want me to speak?" Ethan asked, surprised. "You've lived it," Margaret replied. "If you're serious about making a change, sharing your story could make an impact." Ethan hesitated but eventually agreed. The day of the seminar arrived, and Ethan found himself standing in front of a room filled with police officers, community leaders, and residents. The air was heavy with anticipation. For a moment, he felt paralyzed, but then he caught Margaret's steady gaze from the front row. He began, his voice slightly trembling at first. "My name is Ethan Brown. I was a police officer who believed I was fair and unbiased, but I was wrong." The room fell silent. "A few weeks ago, I pulled over an elderly woman driving a luxury car. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, treating her as if she didn't belong. That woman," Ethan paused, gesturing to Margaret, "is Margaret Johnson, a respected community leader, and, as I've since learned, my own family." Gasps rippled through the audience, and Ethan continued. "I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm here to share my mistakes because they taught me something. Unconscious bias can blind us to the truth and hurt those we're supposed to protect." By the time he finished, the room was filled with thoughtful silence. Margaret stood to join him, her presence commanding. "Ethan's story is not unique," she said. "But what's rare is the willingness to admit fault and work toward change. We all have a role to play in breaking down these barriers." The audience erupted into applause, but the moment wasn't about celebration, it was about transformation. Ethan didn't stop there. He worked closely with Margaret to develop bias training workshops tailored to law enforcement. Drawing from his own experience, Ethan made it personal, recounting how unchecked assumptions had led him astray. Officers who attended the sessions admitted to recognizing their own biases. Some were resistant, but Ethan's vulnerability made it difficult to dismiss his message. "I used to think being a good cop meant being tough and decisive," Ethan told them. "But I've learned that being a good cop starts with being a good person, someone willing to question their own instincts." While Ethan focused on law enforcement, Margaret expanded Evelyn's embrace to reach more families. She launched programs that addressed racial and socioeconomic divides, offering resources for education, housing, and emotional support. Margaret's vision was clear: to create a community where understanding and empathy could replace prejudice. One of the Foundation's flagship initiatives was a restorative justice program that brought together victims of bias with those who had wronged them. These dialogues were raw and emotional, but often led to healing on both sides. Ethan participated in several sessions, sitting across from people who had been mistreated by law enforcement. He listened as they shared their pain and anger, and he responded with humility. Evelyn's embrace began to transform not just individuals, but the entire community. Stories emerged of families reconciling after years of estrangement. Children from underserved neighborhoods received scholarships to pursue their dreams. One day, a young boy approached Ethan at a community event. "Thank you," the boy said shyly. "My dad said he learned to be better because of you." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Every small change, every life touched, reinforced his commitment to the mission. The turning point came during a high-profile incident. Ethan was called to assist in a case where another officer, fueled by bias, had stopped a black man for no reason. Arriving on the scene, Ethan immediately recognized the signs: tense body language, unnecessary aggression, and a defensive stance. He stepped between the officer and the man, diffusing the situation with calm authority. "He's shown you his license and proof of residence," Ethan said firmly. "Let him go." The officer hesitated, but Ethan's resolve left no room for argument. The man thanked Ethan, and bystanders, some of whom had started filming, shared the incident online. It quickly went viral, with many praising Ethan for his bravery and growth. Margaret, watching the footage later, smiled faintly. She saw in Ethan a reflection of the values she had spent her life fighting for: accountability, empathy, and the courage to do what's right. As Ethan and Margaret prepared for their next community event, Margaret placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've come far, Ethan," she said. "We've come far," he replied. Together, they stood as a testament to the power of change, proving that bridges built on trust and understanding could withstand even the deepest divides. Months into their work with Evelyn's embrace, Ethan and Margaret found themselves at the heart of a movement that was gaining national attention. Communities across the country were inspired by their story, but challenges still loomed. One late evening, Ethan was on patrol when he overheard a call on his radio about a young black man being stopped in a neighboring precinct. The officer on the scene was reportedly escalating the situation unnecessarily, and tensions were rising. Ethan immediately drove to the location. As he arrived, he saw the young man standing beside his car, visibly shaken. The officer, rigid and defensive, had his hand on his belt, and the man's voice cracked as he tried to explain himself. "I already showed you my ID and my registration," the man said, his frustration growing. "What more do you want?" The officer's tone was sharp. "I'll ask the questions here." Ethan stepped out of his car and approached, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" The officer turned, surprised to see Ethan. "Just routine," he said. This guy was acting suspiciously. Ethan's gaze shifted to the young man, his steady presence offering reassurance. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Jordan," the man replied, his voice still tense. "Well, Jordan," Ethan said, his tone measured, "it seems you've provided everything this officer needs. You're free to go." The officer frowned but stepped back, unwilling to challenge Ethan's authority. Jordan nodded his thanks, his relief palpable as he got into his car and drove away. Witnesses from nearby homes began to gather, some filming the exchange. Ethan knew the incident would likely make its way online. As the officer began to leave, Ethan stopped him. "We're here to protect, not intimidate," Ethan said, his words carrying weight. "Think about what just happened and why." The officer didn't respond but walked away, his posture stiff. The video of Ethan de-escalating the situation spread quickly, with many praising his actions as an example of what policing should look like. For Ethan, it was a reminder of how far he had come and how far there was to go. Margaret watched the video that evening, her heart swelling with pride. She called Ethan to commend him. "You've turned what could have been a disaster into a teaching moment," she said. "This is what Evelyn's embrace is all about." Ethan's humility shone through in his response. "I'm just trying to live up to the opportunity you gave me, Margaret." Shortly after, Margaret and Ethan were invited to speak at a community conference attended by leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials. The event was a pivotal moment in their journey, offering a platform to share their story and inspire broader change. Ethan took the stage first, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was once part of the problem. I didn't even realize it until I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, someone who turned out to be family." The audience hung on his every word as he recounted his transformation and the lessons he had learned. Margaret joined him, her presence commanding. "This isn't just about one officer or one woman," she said. "It's about a system that needs change and the courage it takes to make it happen." The crowd erupted in applause, many moved to tears by their story. As they left the stage, Margaret turned to Ethan. "Today wasn't just about us," she said. "It was about showing people that change is possible." Ethan nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "We've started something bigger than ourselves, Margaret. Let's keep building." Together, they walked into the next chapter of their shared mission, their journey a testament to the power of redemption and unity. The day of the family reunion arrived with an air of anticipation. Margaret's home was bustling with activity as relatives trickled in, some hesitant, others eager to reconnect. Margaret, dressed in a soft lavender dress, stood near the entrance, greeting everyone with warm smiles. Ethan was by her side, assisting with chairs and carrying plates, determined to make himself useful. For Ethan, this was more than a reunion, it was a chance to prove his sincerity. Word of his past mistake and subsequent transformation had circulated among the family, and he could feel the cautious glances from relatives who were meeting him for the first time. Margaret took a moment to address the group. The hum of conversations quieted as she spoke. Today, we're not just here to share a meal. We're here to rebuild what was lost. My brother James always believed in family, even when life pulled us apart. This is our chance to honor him. Her voice carried the weight of decades of pain and resilience. She reached for an envelope on the table beside her and held it out. This is a letter James wrote many years ago, one I've kept close to my heart. I'd like to share it with all of you. The group leaned in as Margaret unfolded the yellowed paper. Her voice softened as she read aloud. James's words were filled with regret for the choices that had distanced him from his family and hope for a future where love and connection would prevail. Margaret, the letter read, if our family ever comes together again, tell them I never stopped loving them. Tell them love is stronger than mistakes. Ethan's chest tightened as he listened, imagining the man his grandfather must have been. When Margaret finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The moment hung heavy, but it wasn't somber. Instead, it felt like a release, a collective exhale of pain that had lingered for too long. As dinner began, Ethan stood, his heart racing. The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to him. I want to say something, he started, his voice trembling. When I first met Margaret, I didn't mind. I expect she deserved. I let my own ignorance and biases guide me, and I deeply regret that. He glanced at Margaret, her expression unreadable but attentive. Because of her, I've learned what it means to truly see someone. She didn't just forgive me, she showed me how to be better. And I promise I'll spend the rest of my life living up to that. Margaret's lips curved into a small, approving smile, and she gave a slight nod. You're doing well, Ethan, she said softly. But remember, this is just the beginning. The rest of the evening was filled with laughter and shared memories. Ethan listened intently as relatives told stories about James, painting a picture of the man he had never met but now felt deeply connected to. Margaret, watching the room come alive with connection, felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. She reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. We've come a long way, but there's still work to do, she said. Ethan nodded, his determination clear. I'm ready, Margaret, whatever it takes. As the reunion came to an end, Margaret and Ethan stood together, watching as family members embraced and exchanged promises to stay in touch. For the first time, Margaret felt hope not just for her family, but for the future they could build together. The soft glow of the morning sun illuminated the cemetery as Margaret and Ethan made their way to the gravestones of Evelyn and James. Margaret held a small brass plaque in her hands, the inscription reading, "From pain, we build love and hope." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of their journey. Ethan walked a step behind her, his heart heavy but resolute. The air was still, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves. As they approached the graves, Margaret paused, placing the plaque on the grass between the two stones. This is for them, she said quietly, her voice steady. For the sacrifices they made and the lessons they left behind. It's because of them that we've come this far. Ethan knelt beside her, his gaze fixed on the names etched into the stones. He felt a surge of emotion as he thought about the man he had become. I never knew him, he said softly, referring to James. But through you, I feel like I finally met him. Margaret smiled, a mixture of sorrow and pride in her eyes. James would have been proud of you, Ethan. Not for the mistakes you made, but for how you've worked to correct them. That's what matters. They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Margaret ran her fingers over Evelyn's name, her mind drifting to memories of her mother's strength and love. She taught us to forgive, Margaret murmured. Not because it's easy, but it's the only way to heal. Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. It's what I'm learning every day, he said. And I'll keep learning. I'll make sure their legacy isn't forgotten. As they turned to leave, Margaret stopped and looked back at the graves. The sunlight caught the brass plaque, making it gleam. This isn't an ending, Ethan, she said firmly. It's a new beginning. For us, for the family, and for the work we still have to do. Ethan glanced at her, his resolve clear. We'll keep going, Margaret. For them. For everyone who needs to know that change is possible. They walked away together, their steps in sync, their hearts aligned with a shared purpose. Back at Evelyn's embrace, Margaret and Ethan prepared for another day of work. The organization had grown beyond their expectations, touching lives in ways they had never imagined. Yet, for both of them, the journey felt far from over. As Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing plans for a new seminar, Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way," she said warmly. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Ethan smiled, his gratitude evident. "I know," he replied, "and I'm ready for whatever comes next." Together, they turned their focus back to the mission that had brought them together, transforming pain into hope, one step at a time.